Imagine a man who lived thousands of years ago. A man whose life is mentioned only briefly in the Bible. But there is something extraordinary about his story. The Bible doesn't tell us that he died. Instead, it says that God took him. His name was Enoch. Who was Enoch? Why was his story so different? And what is the connection between Enoch and the mysterious Book of Enoch? Let's find out. Enoch appears in the book of Genesis, in the family line that begins with Adam. He lived many generations after Adam and before the Great Flood. Genesis tells us that Enoch lived for 365 years. But the number of years he lived is not the most important part of his story. The Bible gives us a much more meaningful description. It says, Enoch walked with God. Think about those words. The Bible could have simply told us about his family, his age, and his children. But instead, it emphasizes his relationship with God. To walk with God means that Enoch lived his life in faith and obedience to God. He was not perfect because he was a human being, but Scripture presents him as someone who had a close relationship with God. And then something extraordinary happened. Genesis chapter 5 gives us a long list of people, and there is a repeated pattern. A person lived for a certain number of years, had children, and eventually died. Again and again, the same pattern appears. But when the Bible reaches Enoch, the pattern suddenly changes. Instead of saying that Enoch died, Genesis says, Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him. That is all Genesis tells us. No explanation, no description of what happened, no final words from Enoch, just one mysterious sentence. But hundreds of years later, another biblical writer gives us more information. The book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, says that Enoch was taken by faith so that he did not experience death. It also says that before he was taken, he was known as someone who pleased God. So the Bible presents Enoch as a man whose faith was so important that his departure from this world became a unique example. There is another interesting detail. Enoch lived before the time of Noah, and according to Genesis, Enoch was actually Noah's great-grandfather. Think about that family connection. Adam, then generations later, Enoch, then Noah, and Noah would later become one of the most famous people in the Bible because of the Great Flood. Enoch lived during a time when humanity was moving further away from God. Yet the Bible remembers Enoch for one simple reason. He walked with God. That makes his story even more interesting. He lived in a troubled world, but his relationship with God remained different. But there is another mystery surrounding Enoch. An ancient Jewish religious work called the Book of Enoch is connected with his name. Now, we need to be very careful here. The Book of Enoch is not part of the Bible in most Christian traditions. It is an ancient religious work that was written long after the time traditionally associated with Enoch. The book presents itself as containing visions and revelations given to Enoch. It describes angels, heavenly places, judgment, and mysterious beings called the Watchers. The Watchers are connected with a strange passage in Genesis chapter 6. Genesis mentions the sons of God and the Nephilim, but Genesis gives us only a short description. The Book of Enoch tells a much longer story. It describes certain heavenly beings who rebelled against God and came down to earth. They became known as the Watchers. According to the Book of Enoch, they taught humans forbidden knowledge and eventually faced God's judgment. These stories became an important part of ancient Jewish literature. But again, remember, the detailed Watcher's story comes mainly from the Book of Enoch, not directly from Genesis. This brings us to another fascinating question. Did Enoch actually see heaven? The Bible tells us that God took Enoch. Hebrews says that he was taken so that he did not experience death. But Scripture doesn't tell us exactly what Enoch saw or where he went. The Book of Enoch gives a much more detailed description. It describes Enoch receiving visions of heavenly places. He sees angels, he sees judgment, and he is shown things about the heavenly world. But these accounts belong to different sources. The Bible gives us the short account. The Book of Enoch gives us a much longer ancient tradition. So we should not treat every story in the Book of Enoch as though it were directly written in the Bible. So after all these mysteries, what can we actually learn from Enoch? Maybe the greatest mystery isn't where Enoch went. Maybe it is how he lived. The Bible doesn't focus on his wealth. It doesn't tell us about great buildings he constructed. It doesn't tell us that he conquered kingdoms. Instead, it gives us three simple words. Enoch walked with God. That was his legacy. Thousands of years later, People still remember those words. Enoch's story reminds us that even in a world moving away from God, a person can choose to walk with Him. And perhaps that is why his short story has had such a powerful impact. So what really happened to Enoch? Did God take him directly into His presence? Why does Genesis describe his departure differently from everyone around him? And what should we make of the mysterious visions found in the ancient Book of Enoch? We may not have answers to every question, but the Bible gives us one answer that is clear. Enoch walked with God. And maybe that is the most important part of his story. What do you think happened to Enoch? Tell me your thoughts in the comments.